nuclear bombs. It's hospital evacuation, so it's for anything. For any emergency. So this has got the blue cubes and the first aid kits on it. I'll copy. Just one for each building. You can have it outside. Yeah, and this one's down here. Yeah. Or should it be in each room? Oh, God. Yeah. Your conversation. Sorry, you're on it.
Good morning, everyone. It's just gone 11 a.m. here in Melbourne, and we'll give people another moment or two to join the meeting. I should just let you know that this webinar will be recorded and available afterwards. My name's David McLean from Info Exchange, and I'll be presenting the webinar today, as you've worked out by now. Give people another minute or two. Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Connecting Up Cybersecurity for Non-Profit Managers and IT Managers. My name's David McLean from Info Exchange, and I would like to start by I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We are joining you today from Bunurong and Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation. We welcome the generosity and invitation to us all of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and we're looking towards the establishment of a voice to Parliament. Just quickly, today, the focus will be on the current cybersecurity landscape. I'll give an overview of cybersecurity practices that organisations should have in place, and we'll touch on cybersecurity in the non-profit sector and provide a framework and a roadmap that we believe NFPs can use to get started on or continue their cybersecurity journey. A little bit of housekeeping first up. I've muted all lines. If you have any technical issues or questions, please enter them into the chat. You can unmute to ask a question if I don't appear to be paying attention, but I would encourage you to please stay on mute if you're not talking to ensure a good experience for everyone else in the webinar. I'd encourage you to ask as many questions throughout the session that you can think of. Try and make this as dynamic and interactive as possible. Sometimes I will talk way too much, so please feel free. No question is too silly. We'll have time at the Q&A session at the end to answer anything else you might think of. Please note the webinar is being recorded and will be shared along with the slides within 2 business days of the session. Okay, so to kick off, I would like to start by noting that information security practices are no longer a nice to have, given the increasing nature of our digital footprint, especially since COVID, and increasing threats. We must build information security resilience into our organisations. Security has been in the headlines that we used to say every month, but now we say daily, with organisations across all sectors of the economy being affected. Apologies, I will occasionally knock my little Bunnings desk here, and if things go a bit wobbly for a moment, we'll get back on track. Anyway, here's a view of some of the headlines within the community services sector from recent years, and also recent data breaches in the business sector. I updated it yesterday, but it was out of date by the time of the evening news. Two things I would note: Oxfam disclosed that donor information of over 1 million Australians had been exfiltrated via a data breach when a database was accessed in a security incident a year or so ago. And another notable incident reported 2 years ago involved a caseworker who worked at a community service organisation. They had access to an IT system provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. After leaving their position, their access to the system wasn't revoked, and they accessed confidential information relating to children and committed sex offences. So that one wound up in the courts. It highlights, these things highlight the importance of good security practices and processes, both people and technology. Sorry. Now, just another little thing at the bottom there, just noting that legislation before Parliament will lift the maximum fine for serious or repeated breaches of the Privacy Act to quite a substantial amount. I think my personal opinion is that's targeting the businesses that have been quite complacent despite their resources and haven't, in some cases, just really haven't stepped up and addressed cybersecurity yet. I don't think the non-profit sector itself would face that same degree of challenge because it would be an acknowledgement of our position and our resourcing. However, that doesn't mean we don't get to not pay attention. We have to focus on cybersecurity. Just touching on the landscape a little further, our observation is that we find people trying to get your login details are still the biggest risk. Usually it's through emails, but can also be through phone calls or text. Here are some fairly recent statistics on scams and cybercrime in Australia. The ones on screen are from the ACSC from late last year. These data points are important to review. They highlight what's going on in the landscape. And if you are communicating to board, this can be useful to highlight, although boards are probably quite conscious of cybersecurity risks. Some other things worth noting are that the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, ACCC, targeting scam report, indicated that in the 2021, I think it was, Australians reported around 566,000 scams and losses of over 1.8 billion. Top 3 scams being investment, business email compromise, where people try to substitute bank account details, and romance scams. So that report was from the middle of last year. A statistic from the ACSC, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, from the recent cyber report. In financial year 2021-2022, there have been over 76,000 cybercrime reports. That equates to one more than every 7 minutes, or sorry, more frequently than every 7 minutes, which is pretty stunning. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner received just under 500 data breach notifications under the Notifiable Data Breach Scheme in the reporting period July to December last year. That's just 6 months. These are data breaches where personal information has been compromised and could result in serious harm to individuals. Malicious or criminal acts are the leading source of those data breaches, accounting for around 70%. Human error led to another 25%. What? Human error is things like leaving a device or a USB key in a public space, or a report on a bus. These increasing events in our headlines and statistics on cybercrime are a call to action for our organisations to review our security practices. The challenge for us, and I'm not looking at chat yet if people are putting questions in there, because I'm still admitting people to the meeting as they arrive. So feel free to come off mute if you have a question and want me to pay attention. I would say you're aware that the challenge, non-profits, as non-profits, we hold highly sensitive data. Our staff can be more comfortable talking to people and working with technology at times. So there's a challenge there in training and culture change. A key message is that the human element continues to drive data breaches. Recent global research or a global breach investigation by Verizon report released a few months ago indicated that 82% of breaches involve the human element. The human element is the people component. staff to be aware of processes on how to securely share information or how to use technology securely using strong passwords and good password practice. Security behaviours and the culture and sentiment on security within an organisation is greatly influenced by all of you as leaders in your organisation and your perception of risk. And most importantly, these perceptions can be changed. For the techies amongst you, I've heard of this referred to as the human firewall, and strengthening the human firewall is a challenge. Security is everyone's responsibility, and we'll touch on some of the user education activities as we go through this. Sorry, give me a moment. I don't think I have any assistance on this webinar, so I'll just keep an eye on things. Okay. So I want to shift now to technology and process components, having done a bit of framing. This is a diagrammatic representation of the technology layers requiring consideration of security protections. One of the core principles of cybersecurity is defense in depth, and the idea that the idea must be that ultimately layers of protection make it more difficult for threat actors or adversaries or hackers or attackers to succeed. These range from protections on cloud applications that your organisation may use, such as Google Workspace, Microsoft 365 and similar, through to the internet, using the internet safely, the IT network of your organisation, security network devices such as firewalls, securing devices in use, such as those used by your staff, servers if you still have them, specific applications on all those devices, and data protection and standards and practices around how your staff protect data. You might have heard of the Essential 8, which is a set of technical mitigation strategies developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. It's recommended for organisations to implement once they get to a degree of readiness to do that. With these measures in place, it makes it much harder for adversaries to compromise systems. These measures range from implementing multi-factor authentication, which is that additional factor on top of a password that you need to access an IT system, and increasingly many of us are familiar with that, to having data backups in place, to patching and updating our systems regularly and ensuring there's some quality control around that process. So we'll cover off some particular security points that are relevant for these layers over the next few slides. Excuse me a moment. So I could have mentioned that I can be a bit of a numpty with technology at times. So if you feel like you're more competent than me, I hope that's useful to you. I want to ask a question briefly. I'll just bring up a poll as we start to focus on the data layer. I'll just have a question for you here, which is, now I assume that people can see this. Do you provide documented guidance for staff on where to save information? So if you could just pick an answer and we'll see what comes out of that. Okay, so 24 responses so far. Thank you very much. And we can see that, could someone wave if you can see the responses appearing on screen as well? Thanks. Thank you. So thanks for that. Hearteningly, more than half the organisations represented here are providing documented guidance for staff on where to save information, and some of you are yet to move to that part of the journey. So I'll sorry, I need to do that. So let's talk about data protection for a moment. Organisational data is a key asset. It can be data related to your clients, the people you support through your work in the world to make change in the world, or your customers, personal information, or data that's important for particular business processes such as finance. It's really important that your staff understand where to store data so that it's safely backed up. In addition, for information that's confidential or sensitive, for example, such as personal identifying information subject to the Privacy Act, it's important that staff are aware of how to handle this in terms of where to store it and how to share it with others in a safe way. If we think back to that point about the human element and security behaviours, this is going to include educating staff on expectations around data protection. So that will require clear and simple guidance that can be shared with people that they can refer back to whenever they need. In addition, physical document protection is important, particularly now many of us are working from environments other than the office. There's a useful framework developed by Telstra called the 5 No's of Cybersecurity, and it's got 5 data-centric questions that are good to work through that could be useful to discuss with the management team, program managers, and to work through and flesh out what your data protection needs are. Some of the questions are on your understanding of the value of your data and where it's located. And we've provided a link to this framework in the resources slide that will be attached to the presentation we distribute. So if you want to start a discussion about data in your organisation, the 5 No's of Cybersecurity is a good way to start to get people thinking about what data is held, where it's held, what value it is, how it needs to be protected, and those conversations can be really useful. Sorry, I'm just checking on the chat. No, nothing there. Coolio. It's a little informal, isn't it? I have a few more questions that I'm going to ask. Still learning how to use polls in Teams. It's always nice to watch someone else deal with their technology. No, it isn't. Oh, come up. So another question for you all. If I can get my mouse to cooperate, I did warn you. And again, this is a bit of a quick, give us a bit of a quick guide on distribution of multi-factor authentication. InfoExchange conducts an annual technology in the non-profit sector survey. Last year, we found that approximately a third of the responding organisations hadn't yet implemented MFA for key systems. So quite interested to see how people here today are progressing on that. And again, I think you should be able to see the poll results. Thank you to those who've responded so far. And we have something that pretty much reflects last year's IT survey coming up. 2/3 of organisations responding have implemented MFA for key systems. Just under a third haven't yet or aren't sure. If your organisation hasn't yet got to MFA, it's a key protection. And for those that don't have it yet, it's your first big, quick win to implement. It will save a lot of grief. And I speak with experience. I was InfoExchange's IT services service delivery manager. And once we rolled MFA out across our customer base, the number of data breaches we've had to assist in and respond to has dropped dramatically. If you haven't done it yet, I strongly recommend it. Okay, I will close it. Thank you everyone for responding. And just checking that I have another question for you. And this one goes to complexity of the environment amongst the people attending today. So this one is how many different systems are used across your organization? I consider Office 365 to be a single system, Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace for that matter, because it's got a single governing framework and a single access control schema. But basically we're asking here, who has quite a simple environment to deal with? Who's getting more complex? Are there people who are dealing with more than 12 systems you know about? Lots. And then another possibility is that some organisations actually have staff who use a whole range of systems that are appropriate to their particular needs. I sometimes call those shadow systems. You don't necessarily have oversight of them, which can make governance a little harder. So if we look at how that one has been going, I'm not sure if you can see the results. I'm still not convinced I'm using the technology right, but I'm seeing a couple of people have a reasonably simple environment where you're using 3 or less. Many are sitting in the middle range. Some are quite complex. And a small number of people have no concept of what's going on in their organisation at all. Very small organisations, it's quite common for there not to be any idea of what's going on overall. And sometimes some large ones where people haven't yet started formalising how they manage things. As you gain more systems, the value of something like single sign-on, which is the ability to tie a cloud system access, something like a payroll system or a case management system, back to your central directory. So staff only have to remember one access, one set of credentials, and you only have a single central directory to manage. Single sign-on becomes more valuable as you get more systems to manage. It makes the process of onboarding and offboarding, particularly staff, a lot more straightforward. Now, I am not managing my slides well. I do apologise for that. Moving on to user access security, which we've been touching on. Once you've thought about data, next level, what we've been talking about in the last 2 questions, is how do you control access to applications and IT systems, that next level of protection over and above where information is stored. For access to systems generally, many of us are still using passwords. We haven't got to the passwordless nirvana that's been promised yet in many cases. Generally, the longer the password, the stronger it is. Ensuring some kind of mixed case, numeric and special characters is also important. If you have a system such as Microsoft 365 that supports quite long passphrases, the ACSE's recommendation now is that the best kind of passphrase is 4 or 5 words that aren't particularly related to you, aren't particularly a phrase, but which are quite memorable. I can tell you what mine login one is, but that would be problematic. It's quite a good strategy. It's easy to remember a couple of words, and once it's 4 or 5 words, it's very hard for attackers to try and use dictionary attacks to guess. And if so, there's a fair range of guidance on passwords and password use out there, from sort of older approaches through to more modern ones. Once you combine them with multi-factor authentication, password strength declines a little bit. Good password practices have got a level of backup protection for when people are perhaps not managing passwords as well as they should. But I will go back to the multi-factor authentication. It is one of the essential 8 key controls and is well worth doing if you haven't done yet. Advice for staff should be how to compose reasonably strong passwords, not to reuse them across user accounts. That's really important. And if it's been compromised, or if you suspect it's been compromised, tell someone so it can be changed. Dennis has a question on shadow systems, which I'll just have a quick look at. Dennis, that's I think single sign-on is the first thing to try and corral them. I think there's management level discussions on the systems people are using to work towards some common standards and common agreements on what to use. It is quite hard to govern multiple cloud systems when people have freedom to sign up to themselves or even to commit funds to cloud services. So I think it's got to be a discussion across the organisation to do it. Technical controls are out there, but they're not immediately straightforward or accessible and can require quite a bit of funding to implement. Discussion and agreements is probably the best way to start. Happy to come back and talk about that in Q&A at the end in a bit more detail, or to follow up afterwards through the Digital Transformation Hub's Book an Expert function. Okay. I think I'd like to mention that not reusing passwords is key to prevent what are called credential stuffing attacks. Credential stuffing sounds like, I don't know what it sounds like, but it's basically the practice of reusing one password across multiple services. The problem with that is if there's a breach on one service, whoever has access to that breach can try your identity and password combination in other places that might get them in, and that sometimes succeeds. So, for example, once some years ago, my standard password I used a lot was compromised in a LinkedIn data breach, and I'd used that against my then work email. I had to immediately change that password at all services I used it on, and it could have been used to access my work account if someone had access to that LinkedIn breach, which did eventually wind up published on the internet in the dark web. Did that make sense? I'm not quite sure. I should have had that extra coffee before I started, to be honest. So that's the important thing to read to staff. Don't reuse your main work password elsewhere. Don't use passwords that you use, for example, Facebook or Gmail as your main work identity, unless, of course, Google Workspace. If a password's compromised, it's got to be changed regularly. People need to know what to do if they suspect a password has been compromised. Some organisations and regulations still require passwords to expire after a set period of time. In some cases, password expiry is now considered a past best practice. It does not necessarily increase security, especially if there's some kind of enforcement of strong passwords and MFA. It's got a disbenefit in that if you require password change frequently, people will start to write it down in their day book and leave it on the desk, or they'll stick it on the monitor or keep it somewhere insecure on their phone, and that can be problematic. So we're tending towards a more balanced approach where people might require password changes for things that are MFA protected, perhaps every half year or year, sometimes never. Microsoft recommends never. I prefer to rotate passwords over time because you never know when a password manager such as LastPass will be breached, and that might become a factor as well. And the last point I just wanted to make, it's on this slide, is sharing of passwords. Now it's sorry, there's someone else I just let in. Has been waiting a while. Apologies to latecomers and to anyone who got kicked out and tried to get back in. I tried to set this to allow people in once the meeting started, but it hasn't. So I'll work out how to do that a little better in future. Okay, last point. Being the non-profit sector, we work with volunteers. We sometimes work with resource constraints. So the practice of sharing an identity and a password across a couple of people, for example, where they're job sharing or where different people might want to use, say, a survey tool at different points in time, it's not uncommon. It's even used sometimes for primary logins. The challenge is ensuring that when any one of those people leaves the organisation, that shared password is changed so that person no longer has access. So that means you need to register of what passwords are shared by whom and review that when someone exits to check if there's any changes needed. If you're curious, in the resource slides at the end, we've put a link into the Have You Been Pawned website, which just it's a website that helps you look up your identities and see if they appear in data breaches. And it tells you what kind of exposure your own login might have had across the different services you use that identity. It's always educational looking at that. Enlightening might be the word I want to use, not educational. Okay, I want to ask another question now. We're going to move towards BYOD. Internal monologue. David tries to find the polls button again. Waiting for it to come up. It's looking hopeful. So what I'd like to ask you about this time as we move on to looking at managing devices is what's your practice, your guidance to staff on using their own devices? And there's a couple of options here. And again, I would expect to see quite a bit of variation across the people here today in line with the sector. If we start looking at the results, and thanks again for everyone who's responded, I can see, probably more than half of you are allowing staff to use their own devices. Around a third require use of an organisational PC, But again, only about a fifth of you are requiring use of a corporate PC and organisation-owned mobile phone. I think mobile phone, it's quite common for people to allow BYOD phone ownership in the sector. It saves costs for one thing. Info Exchange does. We all bring our own mobiles. But for organisations where staff are community-facing, client-facing, sometimes it's quite important that workers use organisational mobile phones to protect their own personal identities if they're using their organisational mobile phone to interact with clients. So it very much depends on the nature of the organisation. So let's have a think about what this means in terms of device protection. Just keeping devices physically secure and up to date is very important. Going back in time, this is now 5-6 years, you might remember the WannaCry incident, and that resulted in ransomware being deployed to lots of computers around the world, making them unusable. And it was possible because a Windows operating system patch to address a vulnerability wasn't being deployed to systems in a timely fashion, and that was exploited by attackers. Since then, a lot of us have improved our system update processes. Various ways. If you have a managed services provider, we would hope they're using a competent remote management monitoring tool that also ensures all your patching is up to date. If you're not sure, ask them. Brian, I just saw your comment that fully run NFP, of course, everything is BYOD. It has its own challenges, but that's quite a common way to run smaller organisations or virtual organisations. Sorry, that was a little aside. In terms of BYOD devices, what can you do? Staff who use their own laptops or mobile phones, it's important that staff understand some responsibilities to how they protect their devices, and also be clear on what data should never be stored on their personal devices. So I guess it's providing guidance to staff that they should have updates turned on and allow them to take place regularly. Ideally, staff computers aren't used for other kinds of activities such as gaming or BitTorrent downloads or the like. Generally, people working in the sector are fairly sober and calm and don't do that kind of thing. One might think. Whether that's true is entirely another matter. But giving people some guidance as to what they can do safely on the device. If you're a virtual organisation where everyone's using BYOD, but you do hold sensitive information, it's worth talking through with the team overall how to keep that sensitive information just in an online system such as Office 365 or Google Workspace or wherever it should be, and not having it exfiltrate to your device where it could be lost or stolen or compromised. I would also quickly touch on network security requirements, which vary depending on organisation again. But if you've got physical premises still, important considerations are firewall configurations, protecting your network from the outside world. Although as more organisations become completely cloud-based with no on-premises systems or infrastructure, that's not as totally important as it used to be. If you do still have on-premises infrastructure, it is vital. You need to think about the use of secure network protocols, anti-malware, software installed on everyone's computers, virtual private networks for remote access into networks where you still have servers and resources hosted within your network, ensuring that wireless network configurations are reasonable, and ideally having network filtering in place as well with a product such as Mailguard or in Microsoft Defender if you're using Office 365, being some examples of how to do that. Having looked at each of these layers really briefly, and I realise this is a bit of a quick cook's tour. I hope I don't talk too fast. Okay, Elton asks a really good question. Do you have any thoughts on moving away from edge security, which is where we have a perimeter around our organisation that we control? That was the case when we all worked in offices and no one ever worked from home. And it kind of died in March 22 when we all went to our bedrooms. 2, endpoint protection and what's known as a zero trust model, where we're all just working in the cloud. I'm working from home today. which is why I have a background of a beach. It's better than my wardrobe, which I need to tidy. Elton, I think that's a really good question. The answer depends on the kind of organisation, the kind of resourcing you have. If you're volunteer run and BYOD, guidance to staff on how to manage your own computers well is probably sufficient, but also some things like not a little bit of caution about working in public places, a little bit of caution about working on public wireless networks, which I might get time to come back to. If you're a large organisation with complex systems and you have the resources to put in systems that provide a virtual perimeter on the cloud, such as Zscaler, then that's quite a good arrangement as well. So again, that probably requires greater discussion. If you want to be more specific, we might be able to come back to it at the end if I keep moving, or else I'd be happy to refer you to the Digital Transformation Hub's Book an Expert. If you book a cybersecurity expert, you'll probably end up talking to me at some point, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on your point of view. Okay, across all the layers of protection we've looked at, security incident reporting is important to consider. While we can do a lot to prevent them, security incidents may still occur just due to the fast-changing nature of threats and the whole variety of things we're dealing with. Security incidents can be defined as adverse events that pose a threat to your organisation's information systems and services, pose a threat to your confidential data's integrity, availability, or confidentiality. It's important to have means for staff to report any potential security incidents they become aware of. It might be to internal IT support if you have that, or to a particular contact point, such as if your organisation has a chief information security officer, which is often a quality manager or someone like that, they'll be able to identify a contact point for security incidents. Examples of incidents shown here are things such as unfamiliar activity on devices, becoming aware of disclosure of information to an unauthorized person, lost devices, lost USB sticks, even lost paper documents with Excel spreadsheets with contact details. Someone found wandering around your office without good reason and no one knows who they are. Lost or stolen physical access cards, accidentally sending an email with a database spreadsheet attached to it to the wrong person in the wrong organisation. We've all done that and all been on the receiving end as well. It's important to make staff aware of the type of incidents that could occur and their role in reporting something that may be a potential incident. That's the first step in building an incident response process. Identify the contact point, get people to start reporting. It's also an opportunity to have conversations with staff when they do report an incident over clarifying what's important and what isn't, what might not be. So sometimes it's a teachable moment, to use that horrible phrase. It's important to create a positive atmosphere for people raising security incidents. That idea of a positive governance framework applies here as well, to encourage disclosure and encourage that if people see something, they say something. Moving up in the hierarchy, for many of us now, this is in the cloud, the use of email, internet, and social media. It's important to make your staff aware of obligations, including some of the points I've listed here. We've listed here use of organisational email, being aware of phishing emails, what's acceptable when representing the organisation on social media platforms. Now, there's a useful end user policy template on the Digital Transformation Hub, which I'm going to attempt to show to you now. So that sound effect accompanies me showing people things, just so you know. So the Digital Transformation Hub is an initiative at Exchange funded by some very generous philanthropists. That's to build digital capacity in the sector. You might be aware of it. It provides a range of resources to the nonprofit sector, and one of those is this DIY end user security policy developed by PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's quite a comprehensive document that you can take and adapt to your organisation. It includes some instructions up front for how to work through it and publish it, and make it into a useful document that fits your organisation. It's got the usual kind of preamble you'd expect in an end user policy document: introduction, intended audience, scope, end user controls, etc. And I'll just go to scroll. At the end user controls, outline reasonable password guidance, which you might need to refine for your organization. And a range of other sort of things that staff would need to be aware of. So this could be another framework for you to consider different aspects of what guidance you would like to provide in your organizations, and then provide a document that can be socialized with staff and discussed in team meetings, used as a basis for training, and provide a good reference and outline of what all your people's responsibilities are in using technology and helping to keep the organization's data and its clients' data safe. So it's a good comprehensive policy. I would strongly encourage you to have a look at it if you don't yet have one in place in your organization, and perhaps to use that as a jumping off point for that particular element of your cybersecurity framework. Now, I think I need to go back to the presentation. So that will take a little moment for, oh, heavens. Oh, we do the Sound of Music thing. We go back to the very beginning. Excuse me a moment while I display my. Once you've seen this, you'll be able to go home. Okay. Where were we? Here we were. Right. Moving on. Top security incident entry points, just by way of a quick sort of run through. Phishing, I think we know what that looks like, but if you don't, I'm about to show you some. Ransomware, we touched on an example of that earlier. It can come into your organization by links in phishing emails, or by someone having access to a user account, exploiting a security vulnerability. Competent antivirus, anti-malware systems do a lot to prevent it. And once we're in a fully cloud world, the fully cloud world does a lot to slow it down, but it's still a real consideration. Business email compromise, people who intercept emails and substitute details, perhaps on an invoice payable, to put in a BSB, an account number that diverts to an attacker, not to the legitimate organization that should receive the payment. Compromised email accounts can lead to that. We talked about stolen credentials earlier and credential stuffing, where people use the same password across multiple devices, multiple services, sorry. We also think about supply chain attacks. The third parties you work with, they can also be vulnerable to attack. You may need to consider that. Misconfiguration, which is human error when setting up services or devices, or perhaps a staff exit process that has gaps in it. Someone was sick or away, or it doesn't cover all actions that need to be undertaken when someone leaves, can expose organizations to risk. Misdelivery, the old, I've sent the email to the wrong person. How common is warshipping? Now, off the top of my head, Clint, I would have to go and Google that to understand exactly what it is. I've heard of it before. I can't answer that question, but happy to follow up later. I think warshipping is the process of putting malicious software into a service or a device that you're procuring. And I think that comes down to supply chain management and using reputable vendors and strong third-party agreements and strong vetting of your third-party providers. So the ACSC has some very good advice on supply chain and IT service providers, questions to ask those, questions to ask cloud providers. I don't think it's hugely common off the top of my head, but it's been a while since I looked at it. If there's any other questions come up from that, just chuck them in the chat. Now, a couple of real life stories. Everybody has seen phishing emails. I don't know if I need to harp on about this too much, but here's an example. These can be socialized with your staff if it's not been discussed in your organization yet. Staff, in this case, one of us received a message, this email about messages that couldn't be delivered. They clicked on the review button. They were presented with what looked like the usual Microsoft SharePoint login page with their username already filled in. They entered their password and clicked. Fortunately, we had MFA in place, so that blocked access. They then thought, oh my God, what have I done? Or something like that, and phoned help desk and said, I've just done this. And at that point, we changed their password killed all active sessions and got them to log in again. We also do things like check that email forwarding hasn't been set up if someone actually did gain access. There's a range of things we go through when something like this happens, but that's the kind of example of how phishing fools people into providing credentials. Another one we got recently was someone being thanked for their service to the organisation. In consideration of your service, here is details of your salary increment. Please open attachment to review, which they did. It was actually a login screen, a fake login screen. They typed in their email and then immediately hit enter. Immediately, the service tried to log in from another country, failed because of MFA, and they said something like, "Oh, dearie me," and phoned help desk. That's one example of phishing. Another one, email request to change bank account details received by payroll department. It appeared to be signed off by a staff member. Payroll department responded, requesting the new bank details and not noticing that the from email address, if you look closely, is quite suspicious. The second email was received by payroll, and at that point, due to the grammar and the request, they thought, that isn't X writing to us, and it wasn't legitimate, and they actually phoned to check. That's important. So we've got this useful slide from the wonderful people at Hivent, 7 tips to catch a fish. It'll be in the deck that we distribute after, and it's a good thing again to talk through with your staff. It just shows 7 ways. Attackers use social engineering. Basically, they're trying to create a sense of urgency or a sense of importance, and they're trying to get you to do something quickly without thinking about it. Urgency, scarcity, whatever it is, the social driver, it's often quite effective. People will get something saying, you're eligible for a tax refund. Fabulous. Where do I get it? The things to look for are strange from addresses. If your mail agent has highlighted that you've got a different reply to from, that's a warning sign, especially if they're from unrecognizable domains. If there's poor spelling, grammar, or design, that's an indicator, although it's not. These days, people are using ChatGPT and the like to, even if they're not very good with English or whatever the target language is, construct quite good messaging. So you can't rely on that, but it is a red flag. Fourth red flag, attachments you didn't ask for. Don't open them. Generic greetings. The ATO never calls me dear taxpayer. It calls me dear Mr. McLean. We own you. Urgent calls to action. They're trying to use a sense of urgency to get you to do something quickly. Strange links. Hover the mouse over it. If the yellow link that pops up looks unusual, it's probably suspect. So they're kinds of signs of phishing emails that you can share with your staff and help them to recognize. I'm going to ask another little poll question to get a feel for how, actually, I am actually curious about this. It's okay to share. It's okay also to disclose things that happen so we can talk about them openly. This is the last time I'll do this. So has your organization actually been compromised by data theft? Had an IT system compromised? Thanks to the people who responded so far. And it's currently running about 1 in 5 have, just to give an indication of how widespread it is. Tony, that's great. Not that we know of is not an absolute guarantee. Sometimes we find out after the fact, but it is very common. 1 in 4 organisations here have been compromised in some way. It takes up a lot of time and attention dealing with these things. It's a huge management overhead in my experience. So it's something we would like to avoid if we can. Moving on and being mindful of time, just want to touch on some organisational processes that need a bit of a security lens. I won't talk through it in too much detail, but finance, really important to ensure delegations of authority are appropriate, double signatures, RSA keys, the appropriate sign-off on transfers from your bank accounts, and the process to verify any change of bank account details for a staff member or a supplier via alternate channel. So if you get an email claim to you for a supplier saying, hey, we've updated our BSB and account number to blah, look up their contact details you have on record already. Don't rely on the email. Phone them and check. just double check. It saves a lot of pain. It's good to have those processes in place. HR, the things that organisations need to attend to, onboarding and offboarding processes, timely and reasonably holistic. So, for example, keeping a register of people's access to systems. To do this job, staff need access to these systems. When they leave, we need to take access away from all these systems. So that offboarding process is really important. There's a backup for offboarding process failures, which is to run periodic, say quarterly, user access reviews, where you go to the systems where users could have access, get the lists of who still does have access in them, and cross-check with the current staff list so you can identify and remove any that aren't there. Security awareness training refreshers, more on that in a moment. And once again, ensuring that we're grateful for people disclosing or reporting lost or potentially stolen devices or information rather than punitive. That's really important. Encouraging people to say if they see something or they're aware of something, to disclose it so it can be attended to. That's really important as well. Okay, I'm going to try and do the rest in about 3 minutes. I'm not going to talk about these stats on cybersecurity in the sector, but I will note that on Connecting Up website, and this is again in the resources at the end, we have a recorded webinar on cybersecurity for NFP staff. We used to run it as a monthly webinar that organisations could ask staff to attend. We're replacing that with an online self-paced training course shortly that will be made available through the Digital Transformation Hub. And that's something that once it's available, you could ask your staff to review the webinar now, or in the near future, you'd be able to say to them, please do this short self-paced cybersecurity essentials course, and it will give them a certificate at the end if they pay attention. So that's one way in which the Digital Transformation Hub is trying to help you with some education activities if you don't have anything in place at the moment, and it's free. I would like to share with you, by way of moving towards close, a simple NFP information security framework that the Digital Transformation Hub has developed. So information security is a journey, and we all have to start from wherever we are now. This helps you, if you look at what this is, it's a matrix across about 5 dimensions: user access, control and authentication, data information and classification and security, device and network management, the techie stuff, policies, risk management, compliance, and user education. And across those 5 dimensions, it's a set of statements or standards about what you could have in place. So you can use this to have a quick assessment of where you're at in your organization, and then see what the gaps are that would let you move to the next level. Basic is a good starting place to be at. It'll provide a modest level of protection and would be suitable, for example, a volunteer organization running on BYOD devices that doesn't directly deal with lots of sensitive personal data. We think a good goal is to move towards intermediate level for most organisations, and some organisations, because of funder or other requirements or the sensitivity of the information they'll handle or their scale and complexity, will want to work towards advanced standard. That can be quite a journey. It can take 3 years from scratch to get to advanced. So we also provide a little bit of a roadmap on the order in which to tackle things. It's not, it's a guide. Like all plans, it's a guide, and your path may vary a little bit, but it gives you a reasonable idea of where to start. It's worth noting that the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's Essential 8 turns up somewhat later in the process, in the intermediate stage. It's a set of technical controls that your technical staff or your managed services provider would look at and implement. But there's a lot you can do independent of that will make things better. And an early one is multi-factor authentication if it's not already there, some basic phishing education, and just making sure updates are in place, that backups are in place, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that's a potentially useful guiding framework. We tried to condense a lot into just 2 pages and make it accessible and simple. One of the problems with the bigger frameworks like ISO 27001, when you look at it, is it's quite intimidating. It's a lot to get through. So this is a simple and digestible approach that any organisation can use to start on the journey or to continue the journey. Okay, the key takeaways: multi-factor authentication. Yes, these slides are going to be distributed after the session within 2 days. The video will also be made available to you, so you can watch me be an umpty all over again, and the bits where I was going, how do I do this? User education. When you get to a reasonable level of sophistication, thinking about the ACSE's Essential 8, making cybersecurity, risk management, and governance a priority in your organisation. Having the conversations on prioritising it, talking with the board and management, starting to provide basic IT security policies. The digital transformation hub's end user policy template is one, and there's also an information security policy template that can provide the organisation guiding statement of what your stance is. That would be the second policy to go to once you had end user and also privacy in place. Contact point for staff to report potential security incidents. That's the key things we see as being pretty important to deepening your journey, your organisation's journey in cybersecurity. It's something that never ends. Like a lot of things in life, it's a process, and it's something that is always got scope for improvement. It will always be evolving. Just noting that this is the slide of useful resources that we'll be providing. I won't talk through them in detail now. Instead, I'm going to say if there are particular things you would like to talk about before we part today, please chuck them in the chat or come off mute and just shout out. I would also, before we wind up, like to thank you for your time and attention today in coming along to this presentation. My hope is it will help you in various ways continue the cybersecurity journey within your organisation. That's how we hope to support the sector. So thank you for your time and attention and the care you're bringing to your role in protecting your organisation and its constituents in the wider community that you're aiming to serve. Tony asks how to find an independent person to check security in the organisation. So that's a good question. If you have a managed services provider, they may be someone you can ask for some kinds of advice. They're not independent, but they should have an insight into the technical aspects of protection. The Digital Transformation Hub Book an Expert can be a good starting place if you're not sure where to start. We're hoping in the Digital Transformation Hub shortly to launch a guided assessment process using this framework that could help take you through an evaluation for your organisation and provide some targeted guidance on where you could go next that really considers your specific situation. I wouldn't discourage. I would encourage you to look at this framework yourself as well. It's written to be reasonably understandable. You would really only need your IT service provider's help on the device and network management layer and the user access and authentication layer, but the rest of it is stuff you could easily work on yourself. And the hub has a few resources that assist with that. Okay, I didn't touch on password managers like Bitwarden, but they are helpful for password management. Connecting Up provides discounts on Dashlane, so it might well be quite cost effective. It's a competent password manager, but Bitwarden, 1Password, LastPass, despite the data breaches that have happened over the last year, that talks through gritted teeth, that is getting LastPass to pay attention to security. They've perhaps marketed it for too long without attending to it, but they're getting their act together. So any of those password managers are a good step forward for an organisation. I'm not aware of pre-built cybersecurity training modules that could be uploaded to an LMS such as Moodle. We are going to provide a free one online. In terms of vulnerability scanning, if you do need to do vulnerability scanning, this is getting a little more technical. Tenable is applicable right across the stack and moderately cost effective at about something like $6 a device, I think, but don't quote me. Tenable Nessus is well regarded. If you're a user of Microsoft 365 and you have business premium licensing, it actually does vulnerability scanning. Get some help from your MSP in setting that up. That applies to end user devices only. Thank you, Rachel, for your comments. And You've actually asked, Rachel Field has asked a really good question about SharePoint backup. Two things to say there. In terms of data retention, Microsoft provides quite a good framework for SharePoint data retention, but it does need the right licensing that can ensure compliance. For example, if you have board minutes, some cyber insurance policies require them to be kept for term of any board member plus 7 years or 3 years or whatever. You can put a retention policy around that that ensures people can't actually delete stuff permanently from that SharePoint library for that time frame. So SharePoint itself can ensure retention. If you need an independent backup, you could look at something like Cloud Ally or Shadow Protect, not Shadow Protect, spanning. So there are some products that will back up Microsoft 365 email and SharePoint email stores and SharePoint libraries, OneDrive and the like. And some of them will also cover other products such as Salesforce. Ishani has a company that has great quick training modules, 2 to 5 minute videos that have been well received by staff. Ishani, if you were happy to put a link to those in the chat, Elton could get access to that, or I can make sure it gets forwarded later. Tool, external company for backup. Yes, there are online services. Vulnerability scanning we've talked about, spanning and Veeam people are using, all good products. Datto as well. Any last questions? We've hit 12 o'clock. I've done an awful lot of talking. You're probably sick of my voice, but I am very grateful for the attention and people's focus on improving cybersecurity in the sector. Okay, my final comment, in absence of further questions, is within 2 days you will have a copy of the slide deck and also a link to this video should you need to go back and listen to any point further. Why you do that, I really don't know. Cyberaware.com is a company that Ishani recommends for some online training, and do keep checking back with the Digital Transformation Hub every now and again as we add further resources to that over the coming months. I will, yes, 365 Business Premium, there is a lot built into that. I'm going to stop talking now, go off mute and video. I'll close the meeting in about 2 minutes, which gives you an opportunity to share any contact details if you want, or the final phishing simulations may be something that the Digital Transformation Hub can provide something on this year. And I think Connecting Up are also looking to offer phishing simulations. What that is, it's where your organisation engages with a third party who send out simulated phishing attacks and then measure staff click-through rates. And if they actually take the action recommended, if someone falls for the bait, they see a quick training video, but you also get reporting on how effectively your phishing campaign messages are getting through. And it lets you come back to and implement a program of training over time to improve phishing awareness. It's something I would recommend, and many large organisations have it in place. Okay, enough. That's all from me. I wish you well. Digital Transformation Hub, Cybersecurity Resources, Book an Expert. There could be something there that's useful for you. And thank you once again for coming today.